Hello and welcome back to Solomon's Cave and the third video about the resurrection of Jesus. In the previous video I introduced you to the question of the canon of the New Testament. I explained that the formation of the New Testament, namely the selection of the 27 books, was a complex historical process, and I showed a few highlights from the debate that lasted several centuries. It became clear that several books, including the four Gospels, Acts, and most of Paul, were universally accepted, while other books took a bit longer before they were accepted, like 2 Peter, Jude, and Revelation. And there were even some books that were briefly considered, like the Letter of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas, that were ultimately rejected. See this table. But there is a fourth quarter in this table that so far has received little attention. Those that were universally rejected or ignored. These were the so-called Gnostic writings. Which brings me to the following question. Who were the Gnostics and why were they, and their writings, rejected? Now, discussing the Gnostics is tricky. For though a lot is written about them in antiquity, comparatively little of what was written by them has been preserved. That is, we have many church fathers writing long books about what these Gnostics supposedly believed and why they were wrong, but we don't have any writings of these Gnostics refuting the claims and criticisms of these, let's call them mainstream Christians. However, we do have some of their writings, and they do somewhat confirm what these Christian authors said about them. But several of those writings are quite difficult to understand, as they speak in parables and allegories and sometimes use quite esoteric language. So, very briefly, how can Gnostics be characterized? Well, let's start with their name. Gnostics. This comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. They were a group, or better, a loose collection of groups who claimed to have received and preserved a special kind of knowledge. Let's take a little step back for a few minutes. If you read the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what you often see is the following. Jesus speaks to a large group of people. But when he does so, he often does so in parables. But afterwards, he gets together with his closest disciples, of which the 12 were of course the most famous, and he explains the meaning behind those parables. Those closest disciples, including the 12, also occasionally received specific moral and theological teachings that were not shared with the masses, but were of course included in the four Gospels and later also preached in all the early churches. Now what Gnostics did was take this one step further. The real knowledge wasn't what Jesus told the masses, nor was it what was preached in the early churches. Since the real truth was not preached or written down in the four Gospels we have, but it was passed down by the disciples to a select few, in secret. This was Jesus' real message, they claimed, not what the mainstream church believed. What the mainstream church believed, so they claimed, was a simplified, watered down and wrong version of Jesus' message. For many centuries, most Gnostic writings were lost, however, and almost all of our knowledge about them came from the early church leaders who criticized them. This changed in 1945, however, when a large cache of documents was found in Nag Hammadi in Egypt. Most of these writings are now published and translated into English, so you can go and read them for yourself. In the end, it turned out that though the early church leaders were harsh, critical, and somewhat exaggerated in their descriptions of the Gnostics, they were not completely off the mark either. So, what is the content of their beliefs? Well, in short, it was quite mystical and esoteric, and it mixed some of the more speculative parts of Greek philosophy with myths from various religions. They also typically distinguished between the highest God, the Father of Jesus, on the one hand, and the creator of the world, or the demiurge, who is the God of the Old Testament, on the other hand. The Old Testament and its God were rejected as being lesser. Another typical belief of the Gnostics was the idea that the human soul has its origin outside of the physical world in some sort of eternal realm, and then being born became a form of temporary imprisonment of the soul, and death offered release from this flesh prison back to the eternal spiritual world. At least for some. Now, have I done justice to the Gnostics? No, absolutely not. There is a lot more to dig into, but I'm afraid that for the purposes of this video, I'll have to end the discussion here, in part because anything else I say about the Gnostics is heavily disputed among scholars. So getting back to the question as to why these Gnostic writings were not included in the New Testament, and why their rejection by mainstream Christianity was universal, the Church wanted to preserve and live out the teachings of Jesus and continue his mission as relayed by all of his closest disciples and as they preached in all churches since the day of Pentecost. There was no special secret knowledge that was hidden from 99% of all churches. Hence, writings like the Gospel of Philip, or the Apocryphon of John, or the Dialogue of the Savior, etc., were rejected. Christians also valued the Old Testament and believed that the Creator God from the Old Testament was the same God as the Father about whom Jesus preached. Additionally, all of those Gnostic writings were written in the 2nd century at the earliest, in contrast to the vast majority of New Testament texts, which were largely written in the 1st century, with only some, perhaps, written in the first decades of the 2nd century at the latest. A brief introduction to critical scholarship. Critical scholars, I consider those scholars who are specialized in the New Testament, but either do not consider themselves Christians, or who do call themselves Christians, but are, let's say, hesitant to accept the claim that the New Testament was inspired by God. So, what do critical scholars believe? And how do they evaluate the primary sources I discussed in the previous video? Well, for one, they tend to emphasize the differences between different groups and subgroups of Christians. Both the Christian groups, let's call them proto-denominations, for which we have documented evidence, and for groups that they have reconstructed. For example, they would look at the differences in the canon between Irenaeus and Tertullian and talk about a fierce dispute between those two church leaders and the groups that they represent. Or they might look at the Codex Sinaiticus, which included the letter of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas, and the Codex Alexandrinus, which instead had 1st and 2nd Clement. Then they would reconstruct a Barnabian, Hermesian Christianity on the one hand and a Clementine Christianity on the other hand, who produced rival canons of the New Testament, both of which were ultimately defeated by those who held to a canon of only the 27 books we have today. They also typically date most milestones in Christianity as late as possible, meaning that as long as any of the books of the New Testament was still doubted by any group of Christians, they tend to present the debate about the canon as ongoing and open-ended. So if, for example, by 500 AD 95% of Christians agreed on 98% of the canon, they would say that Christians had no Bible for the first 500 years. Now, on the one hand, they are almost always technically correct, provided they are up to date on the latest research. On the other hand, it can sometimes give the impression that since the debate about 2 Peter or Revelation was still ongoing in the 4th century, or 1st and 2nd Clement are found in the 5th century Codex, that therefore the canonical status of the 4 Gospels or Paul's letters was still unresolved, which would be the wrong lesson to learn from either the data or critical scholarship. Finally, they also reconstruct the earlier phases of Christianity a little different than you might expect. Though most do not consider Gnosticism to be the original version of Christianity, nor do they take Gnosticism's claims of secret knowledge directly from Jesus seriously, they do think that later Orthodox Christianity was in large part shaped by its rejection of Gnosticism. Here I do think they have a point. Early Christian leaders spent a lot of time criticizing and refuting Gnosticism. And even if they had good reasons for doing so, it is true that often the process of debating an opposing religion or philosophy changes you, as you define, redefine, and sharpen your positions based on who you are debating. This is one of the reasons critical scholarship typically talks about proto-Orthodox Christianity when talking about Christians from the first couple of centuries, especially prior to Nicaea. Confessional scholarship. Confessional scholarship, on the other hand, tends to emphasize a few aspects that I have so far glossed over. Some of these are self-evident, others are perhaps a bit more controversial and open to criticism, but together they do form a mostly coherent story. First, they note that the early Christians already had a canon, namely the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, and with it the concept of a closed canon. A closed canon means that, a few grumblings aside, the debate about which books are and are not part of the canon was basically over. Confessional scholarship usually dates the closing of the Old Testament canon sometime earlier than critical scholars do. Critical scholars sometimes date this event late in the 1st century AD, while confessional scholarship typically dates it in the 1st or 2nd century BC. The books that were part of this canon were believed to be inspired by God and formed the basis for all religious practices and beliefs. Second, though the early stages of the process are sadly lost to history, in the first few decades after Jesus, so roughly 30 to 60 AD, most churches still had direct access to the verbal teachings of the apostles. Figures like Peter, John, and James, the half-brother of Jesus, were still alive. They traveled around, taught the next generation of leaders, and wrote letters. Similarly, some early 2nd generation leaders, like Paul, Barnabas, Apollos, and Mark, were doing the same. Third, later in the 1st century, when more and more 1st and 2nd generation leaders began to grow old and die, their writings, like Paul's letters, began to grow in significance. At the same time, the first Gospels began to be written. Fourth, when we enter the first decades of the 2nd century, the 4 Gospels, Acts, Paul, 1 Peter and 1 John began to form the core of the New Testament canon, and were universally accepted no later than the second half of the 2nd century and probably earlier. Fifth, the dispute about the writings that were more controversial were in large part resolved by seeing how much these disputed letters were in accord with the already accepted canon. Or put differently, the Old Testament, together with the Gospels and Paul, told a coherent story and together established the content and coherence of basic Christian belief. This basic Christian belief subsequently helped to determine what was and wasn't going to be part of the canon. Additionally, it is argued that implicitly several criteria were used to determine if a book should be accepted as canonical. The 4 most commonly cited criteria were that they had to be 1. Apostolic, attributed to one of the apostles or a close associate. 2. orthodoxy. They had to be in agreement with the Old Testament and already accepted parts of the New Testament. 3. Antiquity. They had to be old enough to be written by an apostle or their associates. 4. Catholicity or universality. They had to be accepted by churches from different parts of the known world, specifically by churches in the Greek-speaking East and the Latin-speaking West. My own, somewhat informed opinion. As I stated in the first video, I am a Christian, so it probably won't surprise you that I lean more towards confessional scholarship's conclusions, but there is something else that I would like to mention as well. I started the previous video with a challenge, or a question. Let me repackage that question into a scenario. You approach a Christian with a question: how was it decided that these 27 books, and only these 27 books, became part of the New Testament? What sort of answer would satisfy you? Would you prefer this Christian would point you to a single individual, some important spiritual or political leader? Or would you prefer to be directed to a single meeting or a single document that lists these 27 books and the reasons for their inclusion? Or would you prefer a more organic, bottom-up kind of answer? Perhaps, if you're really honest with yourself, you may realize that ultimately nothing would satisfy you. That's fine. Perhaps no historical explanation would be sufficient to overcome your skepticism. But then, let me ask you, what kind of answer would be least suspicious? Or what sort of historical process would be least objectionable? The fact is that all New Testament books were written after Jesus was gone, and Christianity simply did not have a single unifying prophet or prophetic figure to give his blessing to the canon of the New Testament. No single bishop or council or church father had the formal authority to unilaterally declare which books were and which books were not divinely inspired, and therefore which books should and should not be added to the New Testament canon. No, in my opinion, something else happened. As the New Testament books were being written, the early church received these books and began to read them. They, that is, church leaders and lay people alike, began to meditate upon them. They began to preach from them, and slowly but surely it began to dawn on them that these books were divinely inspired. That is, the belief began to grow that God was speaking to them through these books in the same way as he was speaking to them through the Old Testament. And when they exchanged letters with other churches and visited them on their journeys, they began to notice that the same collections of books were cherished there as well. This process of recognition went very quickly for the 4 Gospels and most of Paul's letters. It took a little longer for some others. But even though we mainly looked at some famous church leaders in the previous video, the formation of the canon was in many ways a bottom-up process, especially for the books that are non-controversial. In fact, if you read the canon lists from the church fathers in their original contexts, you will often find that they heavily rely on, and for most books merely report, the universal consensus. That is, we may quote from Irenaeus or Eusebius or Athanasius, but those church leaders did not tell their readers that these books must be accepted because they said so, but because the church at large said so. Personally, I find this idea that the canon came about due to a naturally growing, near-universal, virtually worldwide consensus among all different branches of Christianity far more satisfying as well as oddly comforting than if it would have come about due to the imposed top-down decision from a church council or church leader. And yes, for the first few centuries there were some rough edges and some, what I would call, minor disagreements between the different branches of Christianity when it came to the exact limits of the canon. But the fact that Latin speakers in the West, Greek speakers in the East, as well as Armenians, Syrians, Egyptians, and Ethiopians all came to accept the New Testament canon is quite telling. Or as one scholar put it, though the fringes of the New Testament canon remained unsettled, a high degree of unanimity concerning the greater part of the New Testament canon was attained within the first 2 centuries among the very diverse and scattered congregations, from Britain to Mesopotamia. These different churches disagree on many things, not least about who is supposed to be in charge, or who gets to decide what to believe. And yet, this, the New Testament canon, is what they all agree upon the most. In a way, and I'm admittedly speaking more like a Christian than a historian here, this lends some credence to the typical notion you might read in confessional scholarship, namely that the Church received, recognized, and affirmed the New Testament, but it did not establish it. Relevance for the resurrection. Harkening back to the first video, we saw that the 4 Gospels, Acts, and 1 Corinthians contain the most crucial passages regarding the resurrection of Jesus. Though his resurrection is mentioned in many other books as well, these 6 books are the most essential. Looking at the formation of the canon, we can see that even though some books were controversial and took a while before they were universally accepted, these 6 books were never in doubt. No one, except for Marcion, questioned the belief that these books were divinely inspired and deserve to be held in the absolute highest regard. Conclusion. When talking about the evidence for the resurrection and the New Testament, it is important to take a look at how the New Testament came about and how the texts most relevant for the resurrection were received by early Christians. If the core texts for the resurrection were doubted and debated for a long time, or if they were not universally accepted, that would weigh heavily against their reliability as historical sources. I understand that, for critics, the fact that the Gospels, Acts, and 1 Corinthians were accepted early and universally may not sound like a great argument, but weighed against the alternative, I hope you can see how we have at least cleared a potential roadblock. Thanks for watching. If you want to support me on Patreon or become a member on YouTube, follow the links in the description so you can see my videos early, vote on topics, ask questions, and more. The following topic to be discussed in the Resurrection series will be on the question of how well the original text of the New Testament has been preserved. For there are thousands of manuscripts, but they do not all have the exact same text. So what does that tell us about the reliability of the stories about the resurrection?